Hello, this is Jeff Gill back again for week 3 of Disciples of Christ, History and Polity. And the theme this week is Reformed Revivalists, Disciples Worship in Theology and Practice. And my backdrop this week is the last church I was senior pastor of, Central Christian Church in Newark, Ohio. And if you remember from last week, looking at the old Bethany Meeting House that was built largely to Alexander Campbell's design, you can see a number of differences between how disciples literally structured worship back, say, in 1852, and how in 1951, well, you see here behind me stained glass and figures and windows and ecclesial light fixtures and as it happens, you can't quite see it, I think, down there, but instead of a central pulpit, you have a pulpit and a lectern and the table in between. What is the right way for disciples to build a sanctuary? What is the correct way for us to order worship? This gets booted about and disputed in a wide variety of circles, and sometimes people appeal to history. And certainly I'd be blessed to say that history doesn't have something to say about it, but want to back off and come at this from a couple of different angles, starting with the question of pews. Now, you may also have a church that has taken out the pews and has some kind of movable or modular seating. You may not even have some newer, more contemporary style churches are different this way. But for an awful lot of us, and for a very long time, it has been, well, I wouldn't call it part of our disciples' heritage, but it's very common, especially in Western Protestantism in general, and certainly in this country, for Christians to come to church and sit in the back, right? You got that same issue in your church? Yeah, I figured quite a few of you would. How folks kind of fill in from the back, and it's always such a struggle to get anybody to sit in the front. And no one really knows why, but we make jokes about it. We expect it even when we move across state lines or into completely new regions of the country, but we're used to it. But do you know why? And it gets at the heart of why I think learning about history, let alone understanding our polity, our structure as a church, and the history then helps us figure out how our polity ended up where it is, which we get to in some later weeks. But here is a great example, a working example of how a church leader, whether clergy or lay, can think about and hopefully help the congregation to think differently about why are things the way they are, and could they be anything different, especially if you're hoping to get to the point where you can make a change or two. Pews and people sitting in the back. The short answer to this whole question is pew rents, but it goes even deeper than this. In the English parish tradition, which I would argue strongly shapes most of American Protestantism by way of not just the Episcopal Church, which is the heir of the Church of England, the Anglican tradition, but also Methodism, which grows out of Anglican roots through John and Charles Wesley, and then has its own particular flavor with Francis Asbury as it grows and spreads in early America. But for all of us, there's this issue back in the old country of how the front box pews or seating, however it was structured in a church, was for the wealthy. And essentially it was common and it was taken for granted that you would tend to have a pattern where the wealthy sit towards the front, and you literally got poorer the further back you went, except after a certain point, then you had the free seating in the back half or even the back third of the sanctuary, of the chancel. Is this starting to ring some bells for you? As a matter of fact, the Free Methodist Church, when you dig into their history, when they separated from the Methodist Episcopal Church and what's now the United Methodist Church, the Free Methodists tend to foreground these days that they were Free Methodists because they stood for freedom. Well, much of the Methodist Church supported, or at least didn't want to criticize, slave holding or slave owning by clergy. But there's just as much reason to think that the roots of the name and the internal affirmation of being free Methodists had to do with saying in our churches, we will not practice pew rents. All of our seating is free in the Free Methodist Church. Now, after you get past the Civil War, this tradition drops away. And what it's replaced with is very interesting. But if you go to churches that are built and have their chancel or nave furnishings that are before, say, 1860 or so, you will find that very often in churches that have always been worship structures, will have little plates or even ceramic plaques that designate the number or the letter of the pew. And when you think about it, that's typical in a theater today. You buy a ticket and you know where you sit. But it goes back to that idea that before about 1850, it was more common than not that instead of a budget and a weekly offering and passing the plate and offering envelopes, you had pew rents. You paid your pew rent, and then offerings were simply for special occasions, special purposes, or simply a poor box for the poor back in the narthex. But pew rents were the bulk of what supported the church. In fact, many Jewish synagogues, Reform or conservatives, operate somewhat in the same basis today. It's not an unusual, historically speaking, practice for how a church structures its budget and solicits income to operate the building and to support the preaching, the clergy, the cantors, whoever. Some form of pew rents or membership dues. After the Civil War, we got away from this. And again, passing the plate, offering became kind of a second half of communion. And then, of course, offering envelopes. They haven't always been with us. And let me set that aside and go back to pews, though. So if you go overseas, if you go to Africa, if you go to Asia, and you go to a church, say somewhere out in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and people are coming from all around the countryside and they're coming into the church, you'll see something that to an American Christian is initially kind of shocking. People come in and they come down to the front and they fill in from the front to the back. Kind of like they do in movie theaters, kind of like we do in everything else. Think about most other kinds of mass attendance settings. People don't do that anywhere but in church. Now, we haven't had pew rents, remember, since somewhere in the 1860s, almost anywhere, certainly not in disciples' churches. So we're talking 150 years, we haven't done it. Nobody talks about it. And yet somehow the culture, the ethos, the habits get passed along. We stopped having pew rents, but people still tended to occupy, well, the back pews, the free pews, or the lower cost pews. And it's noted, going back into the medieval period, that it was common and frustrating to preachers, even in the 1400s and 1500s, that most of the front pews, which were supporting the bulk of the work of the congregation, paid for by the wealthy or the titled or whomever, tended to be vacant most of the year, except for Christmas and Easter, and you'd be preaching to the people further back. Well, now you don't have to have it that way, but we still do it. This is where history sticks with us, even when it's no longer a current practice. And it's those non-written down, non-official rules that sometimes are the hardest things to change. And I think any minister who's tried to get a congregation to move from the back pews and come on down front knows exactly what I'm talking about. But if you're going to change that, and if you're going to talk about changing seating and seating arrangements, sometimes it's helpful to be able to do some advanced education and help your church members think about their own instincts and impulses and habits and ask themselves, so why am I more comfortable in the back? Well, because that's what my parents did, my grandparents, and they did it because that's what their parents or grandparents did, and it simply becomes a practice. Talking about the history of it, understanding where it came from, And why it stuck with us sometimes frees up a whole lot of people to say, we can make a change. There are others of these historic patterns and traditions that are embedded in our worship consciously or unconsciously. Some of them make a big difference, some less so, but they're instructive. They're useful to reflect on. One I mentioned in the question for this week has to do with the Lord's Prayer. Does your congregation say, and forgive us our, right? So whatever you first thought, and I'll admit, I grew up in a trespasses church. My default tends to be to go back to that. But I've served disciples' churches where, at least as far back as they could remember, well, no, we've always said debts and debtors. And I understand quite a few congregations among the disciples and among mainline Protestants more generally have adopted forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Perfectly appropriate. But it's interesting to note, and you can often trace the pattern and the imprint in other areas. If you have a disciples' church that is saying debts and debtors, that's going to come to you by way of a more reformed, a more Presbyterian or Baptist history, and out of a particular translation from the Geneva Bible and how that comes down to us today. Debts and debtors is a much more reformed pattern for saying the Lord's Prayer. Whereas forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, that comes to us down out of the Book of Common Prayer. It's emphatically Anglican, but it probably means that your disciples' church, if they're still saying trespasses, or if their at least recent past was in trespasses, well, they were probably strongly influenced by Methodists. And I would say in large swaths of the United States, I can't speak too well for Canada, but Methodism tends to surround us, and Methodism tends to influence us. And again, it's good to become conscious of these influences by thinking about these patterns of seating and language and in worship. So if your church has a little bit more reformed influence from its community, from a neighboring church, maybe from some previous minister, you're also much more likely to have a prayer of confession and a public statement of forgiveness, coming usually from the worship leader or particularly from the pastor. That's not exactly anything that's out of our own history or theology as disciples of Christ. In fact, it's somewhat slightly counter to it in that it implies that you need the preacher, you need the minister to provide forgiveness. I have nothing against a prayer of confession and a good rousing statement of the forgiveness given to us in Christ. But that pattern in worship and having it as a no-go zone, something that can't be touched or can't be taken out or sometimes can't even be moved. It's just interesting to know that's out of a Reformed tradition of worship. It's not intrinsic to our disciples' heritage. And by the same token, the whole question about a central pulpit. You saw at the Bethany Meeting House, it was a central pulpit with the communion table at its foot, really, more towards the congregation, not meaning a deference exactly, but that central pulpit, that's a very Reformed kind of thing, the centrality of the word as it's preached and the centrality of the sermon. And often out of that Reformed tradition, that means the sermon tends to go at the end of the service. And then there's the separated pulpit and lectern where you have the readings and the word preached, the prayer and the sermon, and the table in the middle. And very often you're going to find that kind of architectural pattern also tends to echo forth a little bit more of a sacramental pattern, whether it's coming through Methodist influences or something else like that. And well, when you have that kind of reinforcement and influence in your worship, then often that means you're going to put communion last. Now, again, you can find exceptions to all of this between the architecture and the sequence, but it's just good to know, where did this pattern come from? And when people say, and I've seen examples from other other classes people have taught for disciples history and polity, and other just popular communications about here is the disciples' way of worship, or here is Alexander Campbell's outline. Well, there's a couple of them in the pages and the volumes of the Millennial Harbinger between 1831 and Campbell's death in 1866. And frankly, you just can't pin the man down. He doesn't really have any sort of absolutely set pattern of worship other than, and this is what's key for us, communion should be part of every time the disciples of Christ gather together. From Campbell, we get the emphasis on every service should include communion. And from Stone, we get the emphasis, which Alexander Campbell had to be, I probably shouldn't say drugged to, but he had to be brought along to be comfortable with. But while Alexander Campbell said we should have communion every time we worship, whether that's every Sunday or every Wednesday and Sunday for that matter, Stone said, and the table should be open. That's kind of the heart of what we get from the founders in worship. Now, would Alexander Campbell like these stained glass windows? Or this church has a steeple too. I find it interesting, I kind of came of age as places like Willow Creek were booming, and sometimes people will snark on those kind of seeker-sensitive or contemporary worship style churches saying, boy, I just don't know about those. You drive up to them in the parking lot and it looks like you're pulling up to a mall. I mean, how can you really tell the difference between a church and other functions of the community? And I find that an interesting criticism, including even the fact that people would say, well, hey, Willow Creek, they don't have a cross on the top of their building. They don't have, well, and again, look up, if you would, online, the old Bethany Meeting House. Take a look at pictures of it from the outside, let alone inside. It doesn't look that much different than any other solid brick building in the community. And that too was part of Campbell's intention, because Alexander Campbell actually didn't like churches that looked like churches from the outside. He wasn't big on steeples or high-placed crosses. And he said that the test of a church building should not be what it looks like on the outside, but the changed behavior of the people who are leaving it. I think Alexander Campbell, he might have had some criticisms for Willow Creek, but it wouldn't have been their architecture. But we've been influenced by, well, other influences. I'm pointing at the Newark, Ohio church here again behind me, and I can think of many other examples around the country. Frankly, the World War II generation played a huge role in this. They went to Europe, they saw cathedrals, they saw churches that lifted their spirits in the midst of war, and there was a huge push after 1945 to start building buildings with center aisles and stained glass, and a little bit more of a more Gothic than Central Christian here is a mix of kind of the ecclesial Gothic and the colonial on the outside. But again, the first century of our movement would have actively resisted the idea of figures like, Christ the Good Shepherd here, or the baptism by John the Baptist in the River Jordan of Jesus. They would have been uncomfortable with this. They liked the spare and the simple. But we've been influenced by our times, by other movements around us. So I'm going to invite you in the discussion board to reflect on what are those no-go zones in your worship service? What are the things you can't touch, you can't change? And let's think together about why that is and what does need to be changed, what does need to be preserved. And those are both, I think, equally important questions. And we will discuss and reflect together on them as you reflect on your own church, your own order of worship, where you serve or participate, and think about, where does this come from? How did we get here? And then how does that history help us think about where we should be going? I look forward to the discussion online this week. Take care and God bless.